20 years ago, I looked my son straight in the eyes for the last time and told him, I never want to see you again. 20 years after that day, I walked into my kitchen one morning and found my dead husband sitting at the table. And yes, I know how crazy that sounds. Believe me, nobody was more aware of how impossible it was than I was. After all, Graham had been dead for 2 decades. I had buried him in a closed casket, watched our children grow up without him, sold the house where we'd raised them, moved twice, retired, become a grandmother, and somehow learned how to build an entire life around the fact that the man I loved wasn't coming back. And yet there he was. He looked exactly the way he had before everything went wrong, maybe 50 or 51. With a clean shave, that light blue button-down shirt he used to wear when he had meetings at the clinic, and the same slightly tired eyes I remembered seeing across the kitchen table every morning of our marriage. I didn't scream. That's actually one of the strangest things about it. I just stood there holding the coffee pot while my hands shook so badly that some of it spilled onto the floor, and all I could manage was his name. Graham? He smiled at me. God, that smile. I hadn't realized how much of his face I'd forgotten until I saw it again. For maybe 5 seconds, I didn't care whether I was hallucinating, seeing a ghost, dreaming, or losing my mind. My husband was sitting at my table, and after 20 years without him, 5 seconds felt like more mercy than I had any right to expect. Then his expression changed. He leaned forward a little and told me very calmly, Laurel, you need to find Kellen. And just like that, every good feeling disappeared. I told him no before I even had time to think about it. Graham kept looking at me, and I said it again because apparently 20 years wasn't enough to make me less stubborn. I told him there was nothing to find. Kellen wasn't part of my life anymore, and if this was really Graham, of all people, then he should understand why. He didn't argue. He only said, find him. Then the chair was empty. No flash of light, no strange noise, nothing dramatic. 1 second, my husband was sitting there, and the next, I was standing alone in my kitchen with 2 coffee cups on the table and coffee running down the side of the cabinet. That was the first time I saw Graham after he died. It wasn't the last. Hi, everyone. My name is Laurel Mercer. Well, if somebody had told me a few years ago that I would eventually be telling strangers about this morning, the morning my dead husband asked me to find our son, the one I had spent 20 years pretending didn't exist, I probably would have recommended that they get some sleep and drink more water. But here we are. Life really is a funny thing, isn't it? Before I tell you how I found Kellen, you need to understand why I stopped looking for him in the first place, because this wasn't a story where a mother got angry over one terrible night and threw away her child forever. I don't think I'm a bad mother or a bad person. Everything has a reason, and I think you're going to understand mine. That night was the ending. The trouble had been building for years. Graham and I met when we were both young enough to believe hard work could fix anything. He was in medical school. I had just started law school, and between the two of us, I don't think either one slept properly for about 6 years. We met through a friend at a birthday dinner, and there wasn't some big romantic movie moment. That day, I almost didn't go because I had a contracts exam the following Monday and thought spending 3 hours at a restaurant was irresponsible. Graham later told me the first thing he noticed about me was that I brought a textbook to dinner. The first thing I noticed about him was that his shirt was wrinkled. So, obviously, romance was inevitable. We started seeing each other whenever our schedules allowed it, which sometimes meant dinner at 10:30 at night or sitting together in a library without saying much because both of us were studying. I remember people asking whether that was difficult, and I guess it was, but when you're 20-something, you have this ridiculous amount of energy. I could work all day, study until midnight, drive 20 minutes to see Graham for an hour, and still somehow get up the next morning. Now, if I stay up past 11 watching television, I spend the next day negotiating with my own knees. Anyway, I finished law school before Graham finished his training, and after he graduated from medical school, he proposed in the parking lot outside the auditorium because, according to him, he'd been carrying the ring around all day and couldn't wait anymore. We married the following summer. Our first son, Everett, came a few years later. Kellen was born 3 years after him, and then, after a much bigger gap than we'd planned, we had Maren. For a long time, we were one of those families that looked pretty good from the outside. Not rich, not perfect, just stable. Graham worked ridiculous hours, but he loved medicine in a way I don't think I've ever loved any job. His father was a physician too, and had offered him a position in a private practice that would have paid far more than what Graham eventually chose to do. Instead, Graham opened a small family clinic in a working-class neighborhood where a lot of people waited too long to see doctors because they were worried about money. I used to tell him he had the business instincts of a golden retriever. He'd smile and say, "That's why I married a lawyer." He still worked hospital shifts because the clinic alone couldn't support everything, and I built my own practice doing civil litigation. We were busy, tired, and probably less organized than we pretended to be, but I remember those years as good years. Everett was the easy child. I know you're not supposed to compare your children, but every parent does it privately, so let's not pretend otherwise. Everett liked rules because rules made sense to him. If we told him he needed to finish homework before going outside, he'd finish it. If a teacher said an assignment was due Friday, it was probably done Wednesday. Then there was Kellen. Kellen could charm a room before he was old enough to tie his own shoes. He was funny, loud, fearless, and the kind of little boy who would walk up to an adult he'd never met and start a conversation like they'd been friends for years. When he was 6, we took the boys to a wedding and lost sight of him for maybe 3 minutes. We found him sitting with the band, asking the drummer if he could play during the reception. That was Kellen. People loved him. And for a long time, we did too, without reservation. The problems didn't really become impossible to ignore until middle school. At first, it was normal enough stuff, talking back, skipping homework, a detention here and there. Then there were fights, suspensions, vandalism, and these strange little acts that always seemed designed to see how much chaos he could create before somebody stopped him. He once set off a firecracker in a school bathroom because, according to him, he wanted to see whether the alarm would go off. It did. The entire school evacuated. When Graham and I picked him up from the principal's office, Kellen was trying not to laugh. That scared me more than the firecracker. He understood exactly how serious everybody else thought it was, but part of him was still enjoying the reaction. We put him in therapy, then another therapist, then a family counselor, then a program for teenagers with behavioral problems. I can still remember sitting in those waiting rooms with Graham, both of us reading the same magazines over and over because nobody wanted to admit how frightened we were. Graham always looked for an explanation. Maybe Kellen was depressed. Maybe he was anxious. Maybe he was angry about something he couldn't express. Maybe we were putting too much pressure on him. And I want to be fair to Graham because people hear what happened later and sometimes assume he was naive. He wasn't stupid. He was a doctor. And more importantly, he was a father who loved his son and couldn't accept the idea that the boy he'd raised might simply keep choosing to hurt people. I was different. I was stricter, and Kellen knew it. If he came home at 2 a.m. after being told to come home at 11, Graham wanted to know where he'd been and whether something was wrong. I wanted the car keys. This caused a lot of arguments between us. Not screaming arguments usually, but the kind that happen late at night after the children are asleep. When you're both exhausted and each person is convinced the other one is helping destroy the family. There were times Graham thought I was too hard on Kellen, and there were times I thought Graham was protecting him from consequences he desperately needed to experience. Looking back, I think we were both reacting to fear in different ways. By 15, Kellen had already been removed from one school. By 16, he was drinking, smoking marijuana, and hanging around older boys who always seemed to have cash but never had jobs. We knew some of it. We didn't know all of it. Parents almost never do. The moment that changed the way I looked at him happened when Maren was 9. I came home from work one evening and found her sitting on the front steps wearing only socks, jeans, and a sweatshirt. It was cold enough that I could see her breath. At first, I thought she'd accidentally locked herself out. Then I saw her face. Maren had been crying for a long time. I asked where her coat was and she wouldn't answer me. I asked where Kellen was because he was supposed to be home with her for maybe 40 minutes until Graham returned from the hospital. She pointed toward the house. The door was locked from the inside. I started banging on it until Kellen finally opened it. He was 16, his eyes were red, and the smell coming from the living room told me immediately he'd been smoking something. I asked why his little sister was outside. Kellen said she wouldn't leave him alone. That was his explanation. Maren had asked him to turn the music down because she was trying to watch television. They argued, she threatened to call me, and Kellen put her outside and locked the door. He told me she was only out there for a few minutes. She had been there almost half an hour. I don't remember exactly what I said to him because I was so angry I could hear my pulse in my ears. But I remember Maren standing behind me shaking and asking me not to leave her alone with him again. That sentence changed something in me. Kellen hadn't sexually abused her. He hadn't beaten her. I want to be very clear about that. But my 9-year-old daughter was afraid of her brother, and I couldn't talk myself around that fact. From then on, Maren was never left alone with him again. It made our lives much more difficult. I rearranged work, Graham traded shifts, Everett helped when he could, and sometimes Maren spent afternoons at my office drawing on legal pads while I met clients. People thought she liked coming to work with Mom. She did, actually. But that wasn't why she was there. She was there because I didn't trust my own son to be alone with her. That is a terrible sentence for a mother to say. For the next few years, the problems kept coming. Kellen dropped out of school for a while, returned through an alternative program, got into fights, damaged a neighbor's car during an argument, and once punched a hole through our laundry room door because I refused to let him take Graham's car. There were also good days, and I think that's what made everything so confusing. Kellen could spend an afternoon helping Maren build a science project and act completely normal. He could make Graham laugh until he cried. He remembered birthdays, bought thoughtful gifts when he had money, and could walk into a family dinner after 3 terrible weeks and somehow make everybody relax. Then something wouldn't go his way, and it was like watching a switch flip. If you've ever loved somebody who lives like that, you understand how exhausting it is. You're always waiting for the good version to come back, and whenever he does, you start wondering whether you exaggerated the bad version. Graham did that more than I did. He kept believing there was some combination of treatment, time, and love that would eventually reach Kellen. I wanted to believe it too. I just stopped trusting it. By 19, Kellen was living mostly between our house, friends' apartments, and whatever temporary job he'd managed to keep that month. We wouldn't give him money for drugs, and he knew it, so he'd do construction work, landscaping, moving jobs, anything that paid quickly. There were nights he didn't come home at all. Then there were mornings when I'd find him asleep on the couch like he was still 15. Graham kept telling me that 19 was young. I kept telling Graham that 19 was old enough to know you couldn't terrorize everyone who loved you. And then came the night my husband died. It was just after midnight when our phone rang. Back then, I still answered unknown numbers because apparently I enjoyed stress. A young man asked if I was Kellen's mother. I recognized his voice after a few seconds. His name was Bryce, one of the boys Kellen went out with. Bryce told me Kellen was outside a nightclub downtown, completely out of control. Security had thrown him out after he got into some kind of argument, and now he kept trying to get back inside. His friends had tried putting him into a car, but Kellen was shoving everybody away. Bryce said security was threatening to call police. I remember looking at Graham and saying, "Good. I'd had enough. If police were called, then police were called." Kellen was 19 years old. I wasn't going to keep driving across town in the middle of the night to rescue him from consequences he'd created himself. Graham heard the rest of the conversation from my side and asked whether Kellen was hurt. I told him no one had said he was hurt. Graham asked whether he'd been drinking. I said, "Obviously." Then Bryce took the phone again and told me Kellen had almost walked into traffic while arguing with one of the bouncers. That's all Graham needed to hear. He started putting on his shoes. I told him not to go. I can still see that moment so clearly that sometimes it feels closer than things that happened last week. Graham was wearing gray sweatpants and an old t-shirt from the hospital charity run. He pulled a jacket over it and told me he'd bring Kellen home, put him in bed, and deal with everything in the morning. I said, "No, Graham, let him get arrested." He looked at me and said, "What if he gets hurt?" And I answered, "He is always about to get hurt. That's how he keeps us running after him." That hurt Graham. I saw it in his face, but I meant it. He came over, kissed my forehead, and told me, "I'll be back in 30 minutes. That was the last thing my husband ever said to me in person. I wasn't at the club, so I'm not going to pretend I saw what happened. Over the next several months, I heard the story from enough witnesses, police officers, attorneys, and security footage that I probably knew those 2 minutes better than some moments I actually lived. Graham arrived and found Kellen outside near the curb, shouting at 2 security guards. He tried talking to him. That was Graham's instinct with everybody. He lowered his voice when other people raised theirs. One witness remembered him putting a hand on Kellen's shoulder and saying something like, "Come on, Kel, we're going home." Kellen pulled away. Graham tried again. Kellen shoved him. It wasn't a huge, dramatic attack. That's important. He didn't wind up and throw his father into traffic. It was one angry, careless push. Graham lost his balance, stepping backward off the curb. A car was coming through the lane at exactly the wrong moment. The driver tried to stop. There wasn't enough time. By the time paramedics got there, Graham was still alive, but barely. Kellen completely collapsed. One of the security guards later told me the change in him was almost frightening. A few seconds earlier, he'd been yelling at everyone, and then suddenly, he was on the pavement beside his father, screaming for somebody to help him. He rode to the hospital in another ambulance because he'd fallen while trying to follow the stretcher and hit his head. None of that mattered to me yet because I was still at home thinking Graham was on his way back. Then the phone rang again. Bryce told me Kellen had been hurt, and I needed to come to the hospital. I asked where Graham was. Bryce hesitated. That pause told me more than his answer. I woke Marin, who was 9.5 asleep, and drove to the hospital with her because Everett was away at college and I had nobody else in the house. I kept calling Graham's phone during the drive. It went unanswered every time. At the emergency department, they directed us toward a waiting area, and I remember seeing Kellen behind a curtain. He was conscious by then, crying so hard he could barely breathe. He kept saying, "Mom." I walked past him. I went straight to a nurse and told her I was looking for my husband. The nurse's face changed. You've probably seen that expression at some point in your life, and if you have, you know what I mean. Medical professionals try to keep their faces neutral, but sometimes they already know they're about to destroy your life. She asked Marin and me to sit down. I said I didn't want to sit down. A doctor came a few minutes later. He said my name, told me he was sorry, and then explained that Graham's injuries were too severe. I remember hearing individual words, but not understanding the sentence. I asked where Graham was. The doctor tried explaining again. I asked when I could take him home. That sounds insane now, but I asked it. Marin started crying beside me, and eventually the doctor said the words in the plainest possible way. "Mrs. Mercer, your husband died." Somewhere behind us, Kellen heard. He started screaming. I don't know how else to describe the sound. It wasn't crying anymore. It was this broken animal kind of grief, and I hated him for it. I hated him for grieving the man he'd just taken from me. I walked into his treatment area, and when Kellen saw me, he reached toward me and started saying he didn't mean it. He said it over and over. "Mom, I didn't mean it. I swear to God I didn't mean it." And, I believe him. Even now, 20 years later, I believe Kellen did not intend to kill his father. But intent did not bring Graham back. I looked at my 19-year-old son sitting on that hospital bed with blood near his hairline and tears all over his face, and I told him, "You are not my son anymore." He stared at me. I told him I never wanted to see him again. Then I took Marin and walked away. There are things people say in the worst moment of their lives that they regret before the sentence is finished. That wasn't one of them, at least not then. Graham's funeral was 5 days later. The casket was closed because of the injuries, and I hated that almost as much as I hated everything else. I had been married to that man for more than 25 years, and suddenly people were telling me it would be better if my final memory wasn't of what the accident had done to him. I didn't want a better memory. I wanted my husband. Everett came home from college as soon as I called. I made the mistake of not telling him everything over the phone because I thought I was protecting him. I told him his father had been in an accident and he needed to come home. When he walked through the airport and saw my face, he knew. He didn't say anything. He just dropped his bag and held me. Kellen wanted to attend the funeral. I refused. His attorney contacted me through somebody else because Kellen was already facing charges, and I said no. People argued with me. Graham's sister told me that Kellen had lost his father too. I remember looking at her and thinking, yes, because of Kellen. I didn't want him sitting in the front row crying while people whispered about what happened. Maybe that was cruel. I was a very angry widow. I'm not going to rewrite myself into something prettier 20 years later. Kellen eventually accepted a plea agreement related to Graham's death and served several years in prison. I never visited. He wrote letters. At first they came constantly. I returned some unopened and threw away others without reading them. Everett read a few of his own. Maren wanted nothing to do with him, and then, slowly, the letters stopped coming. Our family didn't collapse all at once after Graham died. It happened in smaller, practical ways. His clinic tried to continue. Another physician covered patients, then someone else stepped in temporarily. But so much of that place had depended on Graham personally that it struggled. He had been paying for things out of his own pocket that I didn't even know about. Medications for patients who couldn't afford them, little gaps in payroll, equipment he said he'd replace next month. The clinic stayed open for a little over a year and then finally closed. I kept working because I had to. For a while, I was terrible at it. I'd sit through depositions and realize I hadn't heard the last 5 minutes. I'd drive home and forget which exit I normally took. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and genuinely have no idea why I was there. People call that grief brain now. Back then, I just thought I was losing my mind. Everett returned to college eventually. Maren grew up faster than I would have liked. She was only 9 when Graham died, but for years afterward, she acted like she needed to protect me from getting upset. I hated that. Children aren't supposed to manage their parents' emotions, but loss rearranges families in ways nobody asks permission for. We sold the house a few years later. There were too many memories in it, and honestly, too many bills too. I moved with Maren into a smaller place, kept practicing law, and slowly became a person who could get through a whole day without feeling like every room had something missing. The strangest part is that life did become good again. Not the same. It could never be the same again. But yeah, good. Everett finished school and became an engineer. He married a woman named Celeste, who has more patience than anyone deserves, and they gave me 2 grandchildren who somehow discovered within 6 months that grandma's house has fewer rules than their parents' house. Maren became an occupational therapist and eventually moved about 40 minutes away. She married later than her brother did, and honestly, I think part of that was because trust came harder to her after growing up with Kellen. She has a little boy now. I retired at 64. I traveled some with friends, joined a book club I regularly threatened to quit because nobody actually finishes the books, learned how to use video calls, even though I still occasionally point the camera at my forehead, and built a perfectly respectable life. I didn't sit around for 20 years hating Kellen. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear I cut my son off. I wasn't spending every morning cursing his name. I simply removed him. If someone asked how many children I had, I said 2. Everett and Maren. That was my answer. If one of Graham's relatives mentioned Kellen, I changed the subject. If Everett occasionally tried telling me he'd heard something through an old friend, I told him I didn't want to know. I had drawn a line in my life, and Kellen was on the other side of it. Then, 20 years after Graham died, I set the breakfast table for 2. I didn't plan to. That's what bothered me most. I woke up early, made coffee, toasted an English muffin, and reached into the cabinet for a mug. Then I reached for another one. I put both on the table before I even realized what I was doing. For a few seconds, I stood there staring at them, and I actually laughed at myself because grief creates strange habits. But 20 years seemed a little late for mine to come back. Then I looked toward Graham's old chair. He was sitting there. After he vanished, I stayed in the kitchen for probably an hour. I touched the chair. I checked the house even though I have no idea what I expected to find. Then I went online and looked up visual hallucinations in older adults, which, by the way, is a fantastic way to terrify yourself before breakfast. I made a doctor's appointment. I didn't tell Everett or Maren why because they would have taken my car keys and started speaking to me very slowly. My doctor did blood work, checked medications, asked about sleep, vision, stress, and several other things. Nothing obvious was wrong. I did tell him I'd had a vivid experience involving Graham, although I carefully used the word dream because cowardice comes in many forms. He told me grief experiences aren't as uncommon as people think, even years later. That made me feel better for maybe 15 minutes. Then Graham appeared again. This time it happened almost 2 weeks later. I was sitting at the table after dinner, not breakfast, sorting through mail. I looked up and he was in the chair, same blue shirt, same face. I said, "You're really committed to this shirt." He smiled. And I know how ridiculous that sounds, but if your dead husband suddenly appears in your kitchen, apparently your sense of humor does not automatically disappear. Then I asked him why he wanted me to find Kellen. Graham said, "He needs help." I immediately became angry. Of course he did. Kellen had needed help his entire life. That was the problem. He needed help getting out of school trouble, help getting out of legal trouble, help when he ran out of money, help when he was using, help when he damaged something, help when somebody finally became angry enough to push back. I told Graham I was done rescuing him. My husband looked at me for a long time before he finally said, "Not for him." And then, just like the other time, he was gone. For some reason, those 3 words bothered me even more than when he'd told me to find Kellen in the first place. I kept hearing them over and over in my head. Not for him. So if Graham wasn't asking me to find our son because Kellen needed me, then who exactly was I supposed to be doing this for? I tried not to think about it, and for about a month I was actually pretty successful. I went to Everett's house for my granddaughter's birthday, helped Maren choose curtains for her living room, showed up to book club even though, once again, half the women hadn't read the book, and spent one afternoon arguing with a man at the pharmacy who kept insisting my prescription wasn't ready while I could literally see the bag with my name on it sitting behind him. You know, normal life. The kind of stupid, ordinary stuff that keeps happening whether your dead husband has recently appeared in your kitchen or not. But somewhere during that month, I also started putting 2 mugs on the breakfast table again. I didn't really notice it becoming a habit at first. I'd make coffee, take out my mug, then reach back into the cabinet for another one, and I suppose some part of me was waiting to see whether Graham would come back. I wasn't sitting there thinking the coffee mugs were summoning my dead husband or anything like that, but if I'm being completely truthful, I hoped I would look up one morning and see him in that chair again. And once I admitted that to myself, I understood something I really didn't like. I wasn't only refusing to do what Graham had asked me to do, I was stretching it out because, as long as I didn't find Kellen, maybe Graham still had a reason to keep coming back. That thought made me feel terrible. The next morning, I sat at the table across from his empty chair for a long time, and eventually I said out loud, "I'm keeping you here, aren't I?" When I looked up, Graham was sitting there. I started crying almost immediately, which annoyed me a little because I'd spent 20 years imagining all the things I would say if I ever got one more conversation with my husband, and apparently, when I finally got the chance, most of my vocabulary disappeared. I told him I understood what I was doing now, or at least I thought I did, and then I promised him I would look for Kellen. Graham didn't say much after that. He reached across the table, and for just a second I could have sworn I felt his fingers against mine. Maybe I did. Maybe I wanted to so badly that my mind filled in the rest. I have no idea anymore. Then he disappeared. That was the last time I ever saw him, and once it became clear he wasn't coming back, I finally did what he'd been asking me to do. I started looking for my son. Now, I spent more than 30 years practicing civil law, so tracking down information wasn't completely foreign to me, although I should probably clear up one thing television has apparently convinced people of. Lawyers do not have some secret computer where we type in a person's name and immediately learn their address, bank balance, criminal history, and what they ordered for lunch last Tuesday. I wish we did. It would have saved me a lot of time over the years. What I did know was how to work through public records, old court filings, addresses, property information, and the kind of paper trail people leave behind without realizing it, and I still knew a few people who could point me toward places where that information was legally available. The uncomfortable part came pretty quickly because the more I looked, the more I realized I knew almost nothing about Kellen's adult life. After prison, he'd moved around quite a bit. For a while, he was in Ohio, then Kentucky, and eventually West Virginia. There were a few arrests during his 20s, mostly possession and disorderly conduct, along with a charge for driving while impaired, and when I saw those records, my first reaction was something like, of course. Of course, that's what happened. But then, strangely, the record became quieter. He had jobs, nothing glamorous, just ordinary work. At one point, he was in a warehouse. Later, he worked for a roofing company, and after that, there were records connecting him to maintenance work. Then the paper trail became thin enough that I wasn't sure whether he'd moved again or had finally learned how to live without constantly ending up in some public record. I eventually found an old address connected to him near Huntington, West Virginia, from about 6 years earlier, and that was when I finally called Everett. I still hadn't told Everett or Marin about seeing Graham. I know that sounds ridiculous, considering I was now searching for the brother I'd refused to discuss for 20 years, but explaining that their dead father had appeared in my kitchen felt like a separate problem, and I wasn't ready to have my children deciding whether I needed medical supervision. So all I told Everett was that I was trying to find Kellen. There was a very long silence on the other end. Then he asked, "Why?" I told him I didn't really know how to explain it yet, which was probably the most honest answer I had. And after another pause, Everett told me something I wasn't expecting at all. He had Kellen's email address. Apparently, Kellen had contacted him about 7 years earlier. Everett answered once, then they exchanged a few more messages over the years. It wasn't some secret brotherly relationship behind my back, and they'd never met in person, but every year or two, Kellen would send a short message asking how everybody was doing. I got angry when Everett told me. Not at Kellen, surprisingly. At Everett. I asked why he had never told me, and my son very calmly reminded me that every time anybody so much as mentioned Kellen's name, I shut down the conversation and told them I didn't want to hear another word about him, which was a fair point. An irritating point, but fair. Everett forwarded me the most recent message, which was already almost 3 years old. In it, Kellen said he was doing maintenance work for an apartment complex outside Huntington, and that he'd been sober for 8 years. I read that part twice because I wasn't sure whether I believed it. Then I reached the next sentence. He mentioned his daughter. I actually stopped reading and went back because I thought I'd misunderstood him. His daughter. My son had a child, and apparently everyone in the universe had known about this, except me. I called Everett back immediately and asked what he knew about her. He said not much. Her name was Sylvie, and the last time Kellen had mentioned her, she would have been somewhere in her early teens. I sat there doing the math in my head and realized she was probably 15 or 16 by then, which meant Kellen had become a father sometime in his early 20s, not that long after prison. And that was when Graham's words came back to me. Not for him. For 20 years, I'd been telling people I had 2 children, while somewhere, a granddaughter of mine was growing up without ever knowing me, Everett, Marin, or anything about that side of her family. I can't really explain what that did to me. It didn't suddenly make me forgive Kellen. I wasn't even sure I wanted to see him yet. But now, there was this girl in the middle of everything, and whatever anger I had toward her father had absolutely nothing to do with her, so I kept looking. Everett had an old phone number, but it had been disconnected. The apartment complex mentioned in the email had changed ownership, and after enough phone calls, I finally reached a property manager who remembered Kellen. She was careful, and honestly, I respected that. She told me she couldn't give out private information, and I wasn't going to argue with someone for protecting another person's address just because I happened to be his mother. But when I explained that I hadn't spoken to my son in 20 years and was simply trying to find out whether he was still in the area, her tone changed a little. She told me, "Mr. Mercer doesn't work here anymore." Something about the way she said it made me ask whether he was okay. There was another pause before she said he'd left because he'd gotten sick. That was all she would tell me. Eventually, I found another address through a court record connected to a rental dispute. It belonged to a small house outside Huntington, and for 3 days I kept that address written on a piece of paper beside my computer without doing anything about it. Every morning I'd look at it and think, today, then I'd find a reason not to go. On the 4th morning, I packed a bag. I didn't tell Marin because, frankly, I already knew what she would think about me showing up at Kellen's house after 20 years. Everett knew, though, and he offered to come with me. I told him no, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because this felt like something I needed to do alone. The drive took a little more than 3 hours, and I spent nearly all of it having the same argument with myself. Every exit became an opportunity to turn around, and more than once I seriously considered taking one. I remembered the hospital. I remembered Marin sitting outside our house in the cold because Kellen had locked her out. I remembered the hole in the laundry room door, all those phone calls from schools and police, and Graham standing in our bedroom putting on his shoes while I begged him not to go out that night. Then, every time I got close to convincing myself to turn around, I remembered Sylvie. Whatever was waiting for me at that house, she hadn't done any of it. By the time I finally reached the address, my hands actually hurt from gripping the steering wheel. The house itself wasn't remarkable. It was small and a little old, with white paint peeling around part of the porch, a bicycle leaning against the railing, and this ridiculous ceramic frog sitting beside the front steps. I still remember that frog more clearly than I remember half the drive there. I don't know why our brains do things like that. Maybe when something enormous is happening, part of you grabs onto the most ordinary detail available because it's easier to think about a ceramic frog than the fact that you're about to see the child you haven't spoken to in 20 years. I stayed in the car for about 10 minutes before I could convince myself to get out. Actually, I didn't even get the chance at first because the front door opened and a teenage girl came outside carrying a trash bag. She had dark, curly hair, a gray hoodie, and that slightly suspicious expression teenagers seem to develop somewhere around 13, where every unfamiliar adult is immediately assumed to be either annoying or stupid until proven otherwise. She noticed me watching her, so at that point sitting in the car became even more awkward, and I finally got out. I asked if Kellen Mercer lived there. She stopped walking and asked, "Who's asking?" I told her my name. For maybe 3 seconds, she just looked at me, and then something in her expression changed. "You're Laurel." That hit me in a strange way. Not Grandma, not Mrs. Mercer, Laurel. I asked how she knew who I was, and she glanced back toward the house before telling me her father had a photograph of me. That was another thing I hadn't been prepared for. Then she opened the front door and shouted inside, "Dad!" And I almost left. I'm serious. For 1 second, every instinct I had was telling me to get back into that car before the person inside could come out. I had managed 20 years without seeing Kellen, and suddenly the idea of breaking that distance felt almost more frightening than keeping it forever. But before I could move, he appeared in the doorway. And man, 20 years is a long time. The last time I'd seen my son, he was 19 years old, lean, restless, and so full of anger that sometimes it seemed like he was practically vibrating with it. The man standing in front of me was 39 years old now. His hair was shorter than I remembered. There was already some gray near his temples, and he'd lost so much weight that his clothes seemed to hang off him a little. But it was Kellen. You can spend 20 years trying to remove somebody from your life, but apparently, your brain doesn't forget the face of your own child. I knew him before I really had time to compare the man in front of me with the 19-year-old I'd last seen at the hospital. Kellen was holding onto the door frame, and for a few seconds he just stared at me. Then, very quietly, he said, "Mom." I hated what that word did to me. I hadn't heard him call me that since the night Graham died, and suddenly there I was, standing on a porch in West Virginia feeling like 20 years had somehow collapsed into a few seconds. So, because I was still angry and apparently cruelty doesn't disappear just because you get older, I told him, "My name is Laurel." I knew it was harsh the second I said it. Kellen did too. But instead of arguing or trying to make me feel guilty, he just nodded like he'd prepared himself for something worse and asked if I wanted to come inside. I almost said no. Honestly, if Sylvie hadn't been standing right there behind him, looking back and forth between the two of us like she was trying to understand what kind of family drama had just arrived in her driveway, I might have gotten back into my car. But she was there, so I went inside. The house was small, but it was clean and lived in. There were school books spread across the dining table, a couple of pill bottles beside the kitchen sink, a folded blanket on the couch, and the usual little messes that tell you actual people live somewhere. And once Kellen started walking toward the kitchen, I noticed something else. He was moving slowly. He tried to hide it, I think, but every few steps he would pause for half a second, like he needed to catch his balance or wait for his body to cooperate before continuing. I finally asked what was wrong with him. Kellen told me he'd been diagnosed with lymphoma about 8 months earlier. He'd already gone through chemotherapy, responded well at first, and then the cancer came back. Now the doctors were preparing him for another round of treatment and discussing a stem cell transplant if everything lined up the way they hoped. I wish I could tell you my first reaction was sympathy. It wasn't. My first thought was whether this was why he'd finally tried to reach the family after all those years. Then I had to remind myself that he hadn't reached out to me at all. I was the one standing in his kitchen. Before I could figure out what to say, Sylvie asked if I wanted coffee, and for some reason, that almost got me more than the cancer did. There was something so unbelievably normal about this girl, my granddaughter, a granddaughter I hadn't even known existed a few weeks earlier, asking whether I wanted coffee while I stood inside the home of the son I had refused to speak to for 20 years. I said yes. Kellen told her she didn't have to make anything for me, and Sylvie looked at him and said, "You should sit down. You look terrible." The way she said it was so casual that I smiled before I could stop myself. Kellen noticed, and for just a second, the way he looked at her reminded me of Graham. Not because Kellen suddenly looked like his father physically. It was more subtle than that. Graham used to watch the kids when they weren't paying attention, especially when they were doing something ordinary, and there was always this softness in his face like he was quietly taking the moment in. Kellen looked at Sylvie exactly that way. She made the coffee, brought it over, and sat down across from me. Then, with absolutely no hesitation, she asked, "So are you really my grandmother?" I told her, "Technically, yes." She frowned immediately and said that was a weird answer. I told her, "Well, this is a weird situation." That seemed good enough for her. Then she asked why we'd never met. I wasn't ready for that question, but Kellen answered before I had to. He told Sylvie it wasn't my fault. That surprised me enough that I looked at him. Apparently, for years, he'd told her that his family didn't speak to him because of something he'd done when he was young. She knew Graham had died and understood that Kellen had been responsible somehow, but he had never given her every ugly detail about what our home had been like during his teenage years. Then I asked about Sylvie's mother. Her name had been Jessa. Kellen met her not long after he got out of prison. They were both working at a restaurant, and according to him, Jessa had absolutely no patience for his self-pity. Sylvie laughed when he said that, which told me she'd heard the story before. They had Sylvie a few years later. They never married, but they stayed together for a while and eventually learned how to raise their daughter even after the relationship itself didn't work. Then, 4 years before I found them, Jessa died in a car accident. Sylvie had been 13. Kellen had been raising her alone ever since. I asked whether Jessa had parents or siblings nearby, because part of me was already trying to understand what would happen to Sylvie if Kellen's treatment went badly. Her maternal grandparents were both gone. One died before she was born, the other several years later, and Jessa had a half-brother in Arizona whom Sylvie had only met twice. That was pretty much the entire support system on her mother's side. And sitting there listening to all of this, I finally understood what Graham might have meant, not for him. Maybe Kellen wasn't the person he wanted me to find. Maybe Sylvie was. The thought came so quickly that I actually felt guilty about it because it was almost too convenient. If I told myself I was there for my granddaughter, then I didn't have to admit that seeing Kellen sick had affected me too. And it had. I cared whether he lived. I didn't like that fact yet, and I definitely didn't know what to do with it, but pretending otherwise would have just been another lie. After a while, Kellen asked Sylvie if she could give us a few minutes alone. She gave both of us this look that made it very clear she wasn't convinced either adult in the room could be trusted without supervision, but eventually she went to her bedroom. Then Kellen sat down across from me. For a while, we didn't say anything. I think both of us had spent so many years imagining some version of this conversation that the real one felt almost impossible to begin. Finally, Kellen told me he'd never expected to see me again. I said, "Neither did I." Me. He asked how Everett was doing, then asked about Maren. I told him they were fine, and then he asked if Maren was happy. That irritated me immediately. I asked why he cared now, after all this time. Kellen looked down at the table and said, "Because I scared her." And that answer took some of the anger out of me because there was no excuse attached to it. He didn't tell me Maren had misunderstood him. He didn't remind me that he'd been 16. He didn't blame the drugs, our parenting, or the situation. He just said that he knew he'd made his little sister afraid in her own home and that he'd spent years thinking about the things he'd done to all of us. I asked whether I was supposed to feel better hearing that. He said no. Then, after a moment, he told me, "I'm not asking you to forgive me." I looked at him because, honestly, that wasn't what I'd expected either. Kellen said he'd stopped imagining some dramatic family reunion years earlier. He didn't expect me to suddenly call him my son again, and he didn't believe Maren owed him a relationship just because enough time had passed. Then he said, "I know what I did to Dad." And without even thinking, I corrected him. I told him he'd pushed Graham, yes, but he'd never intended for a car to hit him. Kellen looked directly at me and said, I still pushed him. That shut me up. For years, I'd imagined him somewhere rewriting what happened, probably blaming the driver, the nightclub, the drugs, his friends, Graham, maybe even me, and maybe he'd done exactly that when he was younger. I have no idea, but the man sitting in front of me wasn't doing it anymore. He told me prison hadn't magically changed him either. After he got out, he went right back to using drugs. He was arrested twice, bounced between temporary jobs, slept in cars and on friends' couches, and generally continued living the same kind of life he'd been living before Graham died. Except now, he also had the weight of knowing what he'd done to his father. Then Sylvie was born, and even that didn't immediately fix him. I appreciated him saying that because if he'd tried telling me that the moment he held his baby daughter, he suddenly became a perfect man, I probably would have stopped listening. What actually changed things happened when Sylvie was around 2 years old. Jessa had had enough. Kellen was still disappearing for days, still using, still punching walls when he got angry, and eventually she took Sylvie and left. She told him very plainly that she wasn't going to raise their daughter around a man who made a house feel unsafe. For almost 6 months, Kellen barely saw his child. And according to him, that was the first time he really understood what he'd done to our family, because now he was watching somebody protect a little girl from him, the same way I'd once tried to protect Marin. That comparison stayed with him. He went into treatment. He relapsed twice. Then eventually he got sober. By the time I found him, he'd been sober for almost 11 years. Jessa slowly allowed him back into Sylvie's life, and even though their relationship never turned into some perfect romantic reconciliation, they became good enough parents together that Sylvie grew up with both of them involved. Then Jessa died, and suddenly Kellen was the only parent Sylvie had left. I asked him why, after getting sober and rebuilding his life, he had never contacted me. Kellen looked genuinely confused for a second. Then he said, "You told me never to come back." I told him people say things when they're grieving. He gave me this tired little look and said, "You meant it, Mom." And the worst part was, he was right. I had meant it. Kellen explained that he'd written letters for years because in his mind, sending a letter wasn't the same as showing up at my door and violating what I'd asked for. When I kept sending them back unopened or stopped responding entirely, eventually he stopped writing. Everett was the only person who answered him later. Even then, Kellen said he kept it small. A message every year or two asking how everybody was, maybe saying where he was working or whether Sylvie was doing well. He never asked Everett for money. He never asked for my address, and he never asked his brother to convince me to see him. I believed that because Everett would have told me if he'd been pushed into the middle. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours. And no, it wasn't warm. It wasn't some beautiful reunion where 20 years melted away because everybody finally said the right things. Sometimes I'd be halfway through a sentence and suddenly get angry all over again. Other times Kellen would start explaining something, see my face and stop, because he understood there wasn't an explanation in the world that would make certain memories disappear. But we stayed there. We kept talking. Eventually Sylvie came back out of her room, looked at both of us, and asked whether anybody planned to eat dinner because she was starving. And honestly, that girl may have saved us from spending another 3 hours drowning in the past simply by being 16 years old and hungry. So we ordered pizza. I stayed a lot longer than I'd planned. Once the pizza arrived, Sylvie started asking questions about Graham, which caught me a little off guard because I hadn't really thought about what Kellen might have told her about her grandfather. Apparently, he'd shared stories over the years, but most of them came from his own childhood. So there was this whole adult version of Graham that she knew almost nothing about. And once she started asking, well, I found myself wanting to tell her. I told her Graham hated olives but would order them on pizza because I liked them, then complain the entire time that they had contaminated his half. I told her he couldn't fold a fitted sheet to save his life and had spent our entire marriage insisting that nobody actually could, people just pretended they knew how. I even told her about the time he fell asleep during the previews at a movie theater because he'd been working for something like 30 hours and still refused to cancel our date. Sylvie thought that was hilarious. Kellen, on the other hand, barely said anything while I talked. Every once in a while, he'd smile at something, but mostly he sat there listening, and at one point I looked over and realized there were tears in his eyes. He turned his face away when he noticed me watching. I let him. By the time I finally stood up to leave, I'd been there for hours, and as I picked up my purse, Sylvie asked if I was coming back. That question caught me completely unprepared. I looked at Kellen without really knowing why. Maybe because some part of me expected him to answer for me, but he didn't. He just sat there and let the decision remain mine. So I told Sylvie the truth. I don't know. She nodded like she understood that this was probably the best answer she was going to get that day and simply said, "Okay." I managed to get outside, walk to the car, and close the door before I started crying. And it wasn't only because Kellen was sick. Of course, that was part of it, whether I wanted to admit it or not. But what really hit me sitting there in that car was the realization that for 20 years, I'd kept my son frozen at 19. Whenever I thought of Kellen, I didn't picture a middle-aged man. I pictured that boy in the hospital, blood near his hairline, crying while I told him he wasn't my son anymore. That was the version of him I'd carried with me for 2 decades. And now I'd just spent an afternoon with a man who was still responsible for everything that 19-year-old had done. Yes, but who was also almost 40, had been sober for years, raised a daughter, paid bills, survived the death of her mother, was going through cancer treatment, and apparently spent part of his life arguing with a teenager about wet towels being left on the bathroom floor. I didn't know where to put all of that. It would have been easier if he'd been exactly the man I'd expected to find, because then I could have gone home and told myself I'd been right for 20 years. Instead, he'd changed just enough to make everything more complicated. When I got home, the first person I called was Everett. He asked how it went, and I remember trying to think of some sensible way to summarize several hours of emotional confusion. In the end, all I managed to say was, "He looks like Graham." Everett got very quiet after that. Then I called Marin, and that conversation was much harder. The second I told her I'd found Kellen, she asked why I had gone looking for him at all. I explained about his illness, told her about Sylvie, and tried very carefully not to sound like I was defending him because I already knew how that would land. Marin said she didn't care that Kellen was sick. At least that's what she said first. Then everything she'd apparently been carrying for years started coming out. She reminded me that Kellen had made her afraid inside her own home, that as a little girl she'd learned to listen for his footsteps in the hallway so she could tell what kind of mood he was in, and that after Graham died, the whole family became so consumed by the accident and by what Kellen had done that almost nobody stopped to ask what it had been like for her. She had lost her father at 9 years old, but she had also spent years before that learning to be afraid of her own brother. Hearing her say it, that plainly hurt because she was right. I told her I wasn't asking her to forgive Kellen, and she immediately said, "You will." I told her no, but Marin wasn't really talking about forgiveness yet. She was talking about a pattern she remembered from childhood. She said, "Mom, this is how it always started. Dad would see one good thing in him, and suddenly the rest of us were supposed to forget everything else." That stayed with me because I knew exactly what she meant. Graham had loved Kellen so much that sometimes one good week was enough to make him believe the bad years were finally over, and Marin was terrified I was about to do the same thing simply because I'd found Kellen sick, sober, and raising a daughter. So I told her something I probably should have said much sooner. Kellen could become the best man in the entire state of West Virginia, and it still wouldn't rewrite her childhood. I wasn't going to ask her to see him. I wasn't going to tell her 20 years was long enough, and I definitely wasn't going to start using words like family and forgiveness to pressure her into feeling something she didn't feel. Then I told her more about Sylvie. Marin didn't respond for a while, and when she finally did, the first thing she asked was how old the girl was. I told her 16. Then she asked me whether Sylvie was safe with Kellen. That question told me something about Marin that I don't think she even realized herself. She might not have cared what happened to her brother at that moment, but she absolutely cared whether another little girl was living in the same kind of fear she'd once lived with. I told her that from everything I'd seen, Sylvie seemed safe with him. Actually, more than safe. She seemed comfortable with him in that completely ordinary teenage way where she could insult his appearance, tell him what to do, and roll her eyes without checking first whether he'd explode. Maren didn't suddenly ask to meet Kellen after hearing that, but she asked another question about Sylvie, then another. A few days later, Sylvie texted me. I hadn't given her my number, so obviously Kellen had, although I noticed he'd apparently had enough sense to give it to his daughter rather than use it himself. Her first message said, "Thanks for the Graham stories. Dad only tells the boring ones." That made me laugh. A minute later, another message arrived with a photograph attached. Kellen was asleep on the couch with his mouth open, looking about as dignified as you'd expect from a man halfway through chemotherapy. Underneath it, Sylvie had written, "This is what chemo does to a person who swears he is not tired." I stared at that picture for a few seconds, trying to decide whether laughing at my sick, estranged son was appropriate. Then I laughed anyway. And that was sort of how Sylvie and I began talking. At first, it was mostly text messages every few days. She'd ask something about the family, send me a picture from school, complain about homework, or tell me something ridiculous her father had done. One afternoon, she actually called because she needed help with an essay, and according to her, Kellen was completely useless at grammar. I reminded her that I'd spent my career as a lawyer, not an English teacher. She told me that was close enough. I don't think 16-year-olds understand how professions work. Kellen and I started speaking occasionally too, but our conversations were very different from the ones I had with Sylvie. There was still this careful distance between us, and neither of us seemed willing to push too hard against it. He never called because he was lonely or because he wanted to talk about the past. Usually there was some practical reason, something involving Sylvie, an appointment or his treatment, and honestly, I appreciated that because I wasn't ready for him to start behaving like 20 years had disappeared. Then, one afternoon, he called and asked whether I could come back to Huntington. His doctors were preparing him for another stretch of treatment, and there was a real possibility he'd be in the hospital for several weeks. He'd been trying to arrange everything ahead of time for Sylvie, and before he even finished explaining, I had a pretty good idea what he wanted from me. Kellen asked whether I'd be willing to become her temporary guardian if he became too sick to take care of her. I didn't answer right away. He immediately told me there was no pressure, which almost made me laugh because, come on, of course there was pressure. There was a 16-year-old girl whose father had cancer and whose mother was already dead. You can't put that information in front of somebody and then say, there's no pressure. Still, I told him I needed time, and more importantly, I needed to talk to Everett and Maren. Everett's answer came quickly. He thought we should help Sylvie. Maren's didn't. She wasn't angry with the girl, and I want to make that clear. What worried her was what accepting responsibility for Kellen's daughter might mean for the rest of us. She was afraid that Sylvie would become a bridge Kellen could use to slowly work his way back into every relationship, including one Maren had no interest in reopening. And honestly, I couldn't tell her that fear was unreasonable, so I did something I wish I'd done more often when she was younger. I listened. I didn't tell her she should feel differently because Kellen had changed. I didn't remind her that he had cancer. I didn't say family was family, and I didn't start giving her some speech about how forgiveness was important for her own peace. I just let her tell me what she was afraid of. Then I promised her that helping Sylvie would not become some backdoor for Kellen to reach her. If Maren wanted no relationship with her brother, that boundary would stay exactly where she'd put it. A few days later, she called me back and said she wanted to meet Sylvie. Only Sylvie. So I arranged for her to come to my house, and Kellen stayed in Huntington. Sylvie was nervous when she arrived, although she handled nerves by talking even more than usual, while Maren was much quieter and obviously watching everything. For a while, the conversation was polite and a little uncomfortable. Then Sylvie mentioned that she hated mushrooms. Maren actually stopped what she was doing and stared at her because apparently hating mushrooms is one of those Mercer family traits strong enough to survive 20 years of estrangement. That stupid little detail helped more than anything serious I could have said. Within an hour, they were sitting together looking through old photographs. Maren showed Sylvie pictures of Graham she'd never seen before, then found one of Kellen at about 12 years old with braces and a haircut that, even by the standards of that decade, was absolutely tragic. Sylvie immediately took a picture of it with her phone. I told her that was evil. She looked at me and said, I know. And watching the two of them laugh over that photograph was probably the first time I really wondered whether Graham had known exactly what he was sending me toward when he told me to find Kellen. Or maybe, I was giving a hallucination far too much credit. I still don't know. A few weeks later, Kellen started the next phase of treatment, and Sylvie stayed with me for most of it. Living with a 16-year-old again when you're 69 is an experience I recommend only if you're comfortable discovering that drinking glasses apparently have the ability to reproduce and migrate into rooms where nobody remembers taking them. I once found one in the bathroom cabinet. To this day, I have no explanation for that. But having Sylvie in the house did something I hadn't expected. She asked questions nobody else asked anymore, partly because everyone else in my family already knew the answers. She wanted to know how Graham and I met, why Everett became an engineer, what our old house had looked like, and what her father had been like when he was little. That last question was harder. For 20 years, every memory I had of Kellen's childhood seemed to have been contaminated by what came later. If I pictured him at 12, some part of my mind immediately jumped ahead to 16. If I remembered him laughing with Graham, I also remembered the hospital. Sylvie forced me to remember that Kellen had existed before all of that. Before he became the teenager who frightened Maren and exhausted the rest of us, he'd been a little boy who slept with a flashlight because thunderstorms scared him. He collected bottle caps for reasons none of us ever understood, and once, when we found a dead squirrel in the backyard, he cried so hard Graham had to help him bury it because Kellen refused to let me throw it away. Those memories didn't excuse anything he did later, but they were still his memories, and they were mine too. One evening, Sylvie asked whether I had any photographs of Kellen with Graham. I told her I probably did somewhere, and eventually we found the old box I'd kept packed away for years. We sat down on the living room floor and started going through it together. There was Kellen at 5 sitting on Graham's shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. Another picture showed him around 10 years old, holding a fish that couldn't have been more than 4 inches long while posing like he'd just caught something worthy of a television show. Then there was one of Kellen at 10, holding a fish that couldn't have been more than 4 inches long but posing like he'd just pulled a shark out of the water. Another showed him at 14 beside Everett, already taller than I was and, looking at it now, beginning to have that older face I associated with all the difficult years that came afterward. Sylvie kept moving through the photographs until she picked one up and stopped. It had been taken outside Graham's clinic when Kellen was 17. Graham had one hand around the back of his neck. Kellen was leaning slightly toward him, and both of them were laughing at something that had happened outside the frame. I hadn't looked at that picture in years. Sylvie stared at it for a while and then asked if she could keep it. I told her of course she could. About a week later, Kellen called me from the hospital and asked if I could come see him, so I drove there alone. He looked worse than he had the first day I found him. Cancer treatment has a way of removing whatever little dignity a person is trying to preserve, and Kellen was sitting there thin, exhausted, and wearing one of those hospital gowns that somehow makes every human being look like they're waiting for someone to return their real clothes. I sat beside his bed, and the first thing he asked was how Sylvie was doing. I told him she was fine, although she'd apparently decided my house had been suffering from an unacceptable lack of loud music for the last 20 years. That made him smile. We talked about her for a few minutes, and then Kellen reached into the drawer beside the bed and pulled out a small wooden box. He handed it to me without explaining anything. When I opened it, Graham's wedding ring was inside. I knew it immediately. For 20 years, I'd believed that ring had been lost the night of the accident. The hospital returned Graham's wallet, his watch, and the other things he'd been carrying, but the ring was missing. At the time, somebody told me jewelry sometimes disappeared during emergency treatment, and honestly, I had just lost my husband. I didn't have enough of myself left to start arguing with a hospital over a wedding band, so eventually I accepted that it was gone. Now it was sitting in my hand. I asked Kellen where he'd gotten it, and he explained that one of the security guards from the club had found it near the curb the following morning. Apparently, it had come off sometime during the accident, or while people were trying to help Graham. The guard knew Bryce was one of Kellen's friends, so he gave it to him, and Bryce later brought the ring to Kellen while he was waiting for his case to be resolved. Kellen said he'd always planned to return it to me. The problem, of course, was that I wouldn't let him anywhere near me. He tried writing. I sent things back. After a while, he stopped trying, and the ring simply stayed with him for 20 years. I turned it between my fingers and noticed the engraving inside, "Still choosing you, L." I had those words put there before our wedding. Graham used to tease me about it because he thought "still choosing you" sounded suspiciously like something a lawyer would write instead of "forever." According to him, I'd left myself enough contractual flexibility to reconsider the marriage every few years. I started laughing when I remembered that. Kellen had no idea what was funny, so I explained it to him. And somewhere in the middle of telling the story, the laughing turned into crying. He looked away. That part hadn't changed. Even as a boy, Kellen had never known what to do when I cried. Graham would hug people, Everett would start asking practical questions, and Kellen would look around like somebody should hand him an instruction manual. After a while, he said, "I should have found a way to send it to you." I wiped my face and told him, I probably would have thrown the package away. He gave me this small nod that basically said, "Yes, you probably would have." And then the conversation changed. Kellen told me he'd been thinking for years about what he would say if he ever got the chance to sit across from me again. But now that I was actually there, most of it sounded useless. Then he apologized. And what mattered to me was that he didn't apologize only for the night Graham died. He talked about Maren first, about knowing he'd made his little sister afraid in her own house. Then he talked about Everett spending years trying to calm situations he should never have been responsible for, about Graham driving across town in the middle of the night again and again because he couldn't stand the thought of his son being in danger, and about me becoming the parent who always had to say no because somebody in that house had to draw a line. He wasn't crying dramatically or begging me to tell him everything was forgiven. He just kept talking. Eventually, he said, "Dad died because I couldn't handle being told to go home." That sentence stayed in the room for a while. I didn't know what he expected me to say, so I gave him the truth. I told him that even after 20 years there were still days when I hated him for what happened. Kellen looked at me and said, "I know." Then I told him something else I needed him to understand. Cancer wasn't going to create forgiveness just because everybody suddenly felt sorry for him, and being sober for 11 years didn't somehow erase Graham from the ground outside that nightclub. Kellen didn't argue with any of that. He said he knew. And maybe that was why, a few minutes later, I managed to say something I hadn't expected to say at all. I told him I'd missed him, not the 19-year-old he became at the end. I don't even know exactly what version of Kellen I meant. Maybe the little boy in those photographs. Maybe the son I kept waiting to come back during all those terrible teenage years. Or maybe simply the fact that for 20 years there had been a person missing from my life whom I'd trained myself not to call missing. Whatever I meant, Kellen understood it. He covered his face with both hands and stayed that way for a while. I didn't move closer and tell him everything was okay, because it wasn't. I didn't call him my baby or start pretending that one difficult conversation had somehow repaired 20 years. I just stayed in the chair beside him until he was ready to talk again. And looking back, I think that was probably more honest than anything else I could have given him that day. His treatment continued for several months after that, and there were good weeks, bad weeks, and a few complications that scared all of us more than the doctors seemed willing to admit. Sylvie stayed with me whenever Kellen was hospitalized for longer stretches, but she'd go home whenever he was strong enough, so eventually my life settled into this strange routine, where I was partly retired grandmother, partly temporary parent, and partly whatever you call a woman who has started rebuilding a relationship with the son she once told never to come back. Everett eventually decided he wanted to see him too. Their first visit was strange, because how do you call something a reunion when the two people meeting used to sleep in the same bedroom as children? I wasn't in the room when Everett arrived, but Kellen told me later that his brother walked in, took one look at him and said, "You look terrible." Kellen answered, "You got old." Apparently, that was enough. Everett laughed. Kellen laughed. And somehow 20 years of silence became slightly less impossible after that. Maren didn't visit him, and I never asked her to. She did keep seeing Sylvie, though, and over time the two of them developed their own relationship, completely separate from whatever was happening between the rest of us. I actually think that helped. People like to imagine family reconciliation as everybody eventually sitting around the same dinner table, apologizing, crying, and agreeing to start over. Our family didn't work that way. We had different relationships moving at different speeds. Everett was willing to see Kellen. I was slowly learning how to speak to him again. Maren wanted nothing to do with her brother but had room in her life for Sylvie. Nobody was required to match anybody else's pace, and honestly, that probably made the progress we did make more real. Kellen responded to treatment better than his doctors had originally expected. He still needed years of follow-up, and nobody used the word cured carelessly, but eventually he reached remission. That should have made everything easier. Instead, in a strange way, it made my relationship with him more complicated. While he was sick, everything had urgency. There were treatments to arrange. Sylvie needed somewhere to stay. Appointments changed. Doctors called. And everyone was dealing with whatever problem was directly in front of us. Once Kellen began getting better, I had to think about something much less dramatic and much more difficult. What did I actually want from him now? He was alive. He wasn't going anywhere immediately. Sylvie went back home with him. I went back to my house, and suddenly neither one of us had cancer treatment as an excuse to keep calling. For the first few months, we spoke maybe once every week or two. Sometimes he called me. Eventually, I started calling him too. Those early conversations could be painfully awkward. We discussed the weather for far too long, then his latest doctor's appointment, then Sylvie's grades, and if we ran out of safe subjects, we'd usually complain about something Everett had done, because apparently criticizing your oldest child is an excellent way for an estranged mother and son to find common ground. Little by little, though, Graham started coming into those conversations, and that was something I hadn't expected. Kellen remembered parts of his father that I'd forgotten. He told me about Saturdays when Graham took him to the clinic and let him put the blood pressure cuff around stuffed animals while he waited for patients. He remembered the peppermints Graham kept hidden in his desk drawer, although apparently they weren't very well hidden because all 3 children knew exactly where they were. Then one day, Kellen reminded me about a restaurant we'd gone to when he was little. He'd left some cheap baseball cap there, and by the time we realized it, we'd already driven almost all the way home. I remembered telling him we'd get another one. What I'd forgotten was Graham turning the car around because Kellen was absolutely convinced he would never be able to sleep again without that particular hat. Listening to him tell those stories forced me to deal with something I had avoided for a very long time. Kellen had lost Graham too. I know how complicated that sentence is. My son caused his father's death. Nothing about what came later changes that. But causing Graham's death didn't mean Kellen hadn't loved him, and after hearing more about what those 20 years had looked like for him, I began to understand that maybe being responsible for the death made his grief even harder to live with, not easier. Almost a year after I first found him in West Virginia, Kellen came to my house for the first time. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch looking strangely nervous, which was almost funny considering this was the same person who used to walk into my house as a teenager, like he owned every room in it. For a second, I could see that 19-year-old again. Then Kellen looked down at the carpet and asked whether he should take his shoes off because it looked new. I told him the carpet was 8 years old and thanked him for finding yet another way to make his mother feel ancient. That made him laugh, and the tension dropped just enough for me to let him inside without making the whole thing feel ceremonial. We went to the kitchen and had coffee. No Graham, no strange appearances, just me and Kellen sitting at the same table where all of this had started. At some point, he noticed Graham's wedding ring sitting on the bookshelf beside a framed photograph. He asked why I wasn't wearing it around my neck or keeping it somewhere safer. I told him I liked being able to see it. Then, somehow, the conversation moved toward Graham, and Kellen asked a question I realized I'd never answered for him. He wanted to know why I'd started looking for him after 20 years. Until then, he'd known I'd suddenly appeared in West Virginia. He knew Everett had helped me find him, but I had never told him the actual reason, so I did. I told him about waking up one morning and putting 2 mugs on the table without knowing why. I told him I looked across the kitchen and saw Graham sitting in his old chair, wearing that ridiculous blue shirt, looking exactly the way I remembered him. I told him Graham had looked at me and said, "Find him." Then I explained that it happened again, that his father kept insisting I look for him, and that the last time I saw Graham was the morning I finally promised I would. Kellen didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he sat there staring toward the kitchen table for a while, almost like he was trying to picture his father sitting in the chair. Then he looked back at me and asked, "Do you think it was really him?" I told him I had absolutely no idea. Kellen smiled a little and said, "Sounds like Dad." I asked him what that was supposed to mean, and he said, "He could never leave anything alone." That made me laugh, And honestly, that's probably the closest I've ever come to having an answer about what happened in my kitchen. Maybe Graham was really there. Maybe my mind created him because some part of me already knew there was something unfinished with Kellen and needed a way to force me toward it. Maybe grief can stay quiet for 20 years and then suddenly find a new door into your life when you're finally old enough, tired enough, or ready enough to deal with what you buried. I don't know, and I've stopped trying so hard to know. What matters to me is that before Graham appeared, I had absolutely no intention of looking for Kellen. Afterward, I did, and that one decision ended up changing much more than I expected. Maren still hasn't forgiven her brother, by the way, and I want to say that clearly because I don't want this story to turn into one of those things where everybody hears enough sad information, sits around a dinner table, and suddenly all the damage disappears. That's not what happened. Maren knows Kellen has been sober for years. She knows how sick he was, and she has even told me she hopes he stays healthy, but she still doesn't want a relationship with him. Kellen respects that. He has never called her or shown up at her house, and he has never sent one of those long letters asking her to give him closure so he can feel better about himself. Once, he asked me whether I thought she might ever change her mind. I told him maybe. Then I told him he needed to be careful with that hope because Maren wasn't a door he was entitled to keep knocking on until she finally opened it. He understood what I meant. Everett has a different relationship with him. They see each other a few times a year now, and I still wouldn't exactly call them close, but there's something there. They talk about work, complain about getting older, and occasionally start telling childhood stories that I'd completely forgotten. Sylvie, meanwhile, calls me Grandma now. The first time she did it wasn't some big emotional moment at all, which is probably why it meant so much. She was standing in my kitchen looking for her phone and said, "Grandma, have you seen it?" I froze for a second. Sylvie didn't even notice. She was already opening drawers and accusing the house of stealing her things. We found the phone under a couch cushion about 10 minutes later. I think that's how a lot of the changes in our family happened after I found Kellen. Nothing arrived with perfect timing or some big speech attached to it. Things just slowly became normal enough that one day you looked around and realized they were different. Kellen and I aren't close in the same way I'm close with Everett or Maren. I don't think 20 missing years let you do that. There are birthdays I never saw, jobs he had that I only know from paperwork, relationships he never told me about, and whole stretches of his life where neither of us knew what the other person was doing. There were years when he had no idea where I lived, and if I'm being completely truthful, there were years when I didn't care enough to find out whether he was alive. You don't erase that with a few hospital conversations and Thanksgiving dinner, so we don't try. Sometimes Kellen calls me on a Sunday afternoon. Sometimes I call him because I saw something that reminded me of Graham, or because Sylvie mentioned he's ignoring some doctor's instruction and apparently decided I might have better luck getting through to him. And last Thanksgiving, Kellen and Sylvie came to my house for dinner. Everett came with his family too. Maren spent the holiday with her husband's family that year, and I didn't ask whether Kellen being at my house influenced that decision because, well, sometimes respecting a boundary also means not demanding an explanation for it. The first hour of dinner was uncomfortable. Everybody was being a little too polite. Everett was asking Kellen questions like they were co-workers who hadn't seen each other in a while, and I kept worrying whether every normal sentence secretly carried some terrible memory underneath it. Then one of Everett's boys knocked over the gravy and got it all over his father's shirt. Sylvie started laughing so hard she nearly fell out of her chair. Everett was standing there trying to clean himself with 3 napkins at once, and suddenly everybody else started laughing too. That was the moment the room finally relaxed. I wouldn't call it repaired. That's too neat. But for a little while, it felt like a family dinner instead of an event everybody was trying to survive. After everyone left, Kellen stayed behind and helped me with the dishes. At one point, he looked toward the dining table and asked whether that was the chair where I'd seen Graham. I told him yes. He stood there staring at it for a second and then said, "I'm glad he sent you." I told him not to get sentimental while I still had a knife in my hand. He laughed and told me that sounded like something I'd said to him when he was 16. He was probably right. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, one of the women from my book club asked how many children I had. For 20 years, that question had required absolutely no thought. 2. That answer had become so automatic I could say it without even hearing myself. But this time I hesitated. Then I said, 3. The woman didn't know she'd just witnessed anything important. She simply asked whether they lived nearby. I told her 2 did, and 1 lived a few hours away. Then we went back to talking about whatever terrible book somebody had chosen that month. And, I think that was exactly why it mattered. I didn't go home feeling transformed. There wasn't some huge rush of forgiveness or this sudden belief that everything in the past had finally been healed. I just realized that I no longer needed to pretend Kellen had never existed in order to protect myself from what he'd done. He was my son. That didn't make him innocent. It didn't make Graham less dead, and it didn't create any obligation for Maren to feel the way I did. It was simply true. A few months later, on the anniversary of Graham's death, I woke up early and made coffee. Without really thinking about it, I took 2 mugs out of the cabinet. I noticed what I'd done almost immediately, but instead of putting one back, I carried both to the table and sat down. Part of me expected Graham to appear. I waited longer than I care to admit. Nothing happened. The chair stayed empty. At first, I felt disappointed, and then I started laughing a little because, of course, I was disappointed. I'd spent 20 years wishing I could see that man one more time, and somehow 3 impossible visits had apparently made me greedy. So I sat there with both mugs and started thinking about everything that had happened since the first morning he appeared. For a very long time, whenever people talked about forgiveness, I pictured it as some kind of return, like I was supposed to open a door and let Kellen step back into the place he'd occupied before our family fell apart. But there was no place to return to. The house where we raised the children belonged to somebody else now. Graham was gone. Kellen wasn't 19 anymore. I certainly wasn't the woman I'd been that night. And Maren was no longer a little girl sitting outside in the cold waiting for her mother to come home. None of us could go backward even if we wanted to. What I could do was look at the people we were now and decide what I was capable of carrying, and apparently I was capable of more than I thought. I could sit across from Kellen and still remember exactly what he'd done. I could care whether he was sick without pretending cancer made him innocent. I could believe he had changed without asking Maren to believe the same thing. I could love Sylvie without making her responsible for repairing anything between the adults around her. And I could love my son again without pretending I had stopped being angry. That last one took me a long time to understand. I finished my coffee, then picked up Graham's wedding ring from the little dish where I keep it and placed it on the table beside the second mug. For a second, I could almost hear him complaining that I'd made the coffee too strong again. I looked at the empty chair and said, I found him. Nothing happened. No Graham, no voice, no sign. And this time, I didn't need one. If you've listened to me all the way to this point, I'm curious about what you would have done, because I used to think the answer to that question was obvious. If your child caused the death of the person you loved most in the world, even without meaning for it to happen, and 20 years later you discovered that child had changed, had built a life, and had a daughter who might be left with nobody, would you go? For 20 years, my answer would have been no before you even finished asking. Now, I don't think anything about it is that simple. People sometimes ask whether I've forgiven Kellen, and even after everything, I still don't have a clean answer for them. There are days when I think I have, or at least enough to keep moving forward. Then there are other days when something reminds me of Graham standing by that curb, and I feel the anger come back so quickly that I know some part of me is still living very close to that night. Kellen knows that. He doesn't ask me to forgive him anymore. And I think that matters. He's finally understood that forgiveness isn't something he gets to earn like a prize if he stays sober long enough or becomes a good enough father. What he can control is what he does with the life he still has. He can keep showing up for Sylvie. He can respect Maren's decision. He can have whatever relationship Everett is willing to build with him, and he can call his mother on Sunday without pretending 20 years never happened. And I suppose what I can control is whether the worst thing my son ever did remains the only thing I'm willing to know about him. When Graham first told me to find Kellen, I thought he was sending me out to rescue my son. I don't think that's what happened anymore. I found Sylvie, who had been part of my family for 16 years without me even knowing her name. I found Graham's wedding ring, which I had already accepted was gone forever. I found out what 20 years of Kellen's life had actually looked like instead of continuing to imagine it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I found out that cutting somebody out of your life and no longer loving them are not necessarily the same thing. Most mornings, I still drink my coffee alone. I only pour one mug. That's enough. But every once in a while, especially when I'm tired or distracted, I'll open the cabinet and reach for a second one before I catch myself. I don't get frightened when that happens anymore. Usually, I just stand there for a second, remembering Graham, then put the mug back and keep going with my morning. And sometimes, when nobody's around to hear me, I tell him he was right, which, knowing my husband, may have been the entire reason he came back in the first place.